The Seattle waterfront pier was a battlefield of wind and rain. The Lantern Festival's warm glow drowned by a storm that ripped through the night, scattering paper lanterns like fragile dreams across the splintered planks. James Carver, a tech mogul who'd forged an empire from the ashes of his wife's sudden death, stood frozen, his heart pounding with a dread he hadn't felt since Emily's aneurysm stole her in a single, silent moment 3 years ago. His 9-year-old daughter, Sophie, had been a burst of light minutes earlier, her purple raincoat spinning under the lantern's soft radiance, her laughter a rare melody in his tightly controlled world. Now she lay pinned beneath a mangled tent, its metal frame twisted into jagged angles, canvas sagging like a shroud over her small body. The air was thick with the stench of wet timber and fear, screams clashing with the roar of waves against the pier's edge. James staggered forward, his polished shoes slipping on the drenched wood, his tailored coat heavy with rain, his voice lost in a throat tightened by panic. Through the storm's chaos, he saw a woman kneeling beside Sophie, her hands steady despite the blood coating them, pressing a torn scarf against a deep gash on Sophie's arm. Clara Evans, an off-duty nurse drawn to the crisis by instinct, leaned close to Sophie's pale face, her voice a calm thread in the tempest. "You're safe, sweetheart. I'm here, and I'm staying right here." Her dark hair was matted. To her cheeks, rain dripping from her chin, but her hazel eyes held a fierce, unshakable focus, locking onto Sophie's fading gaze. James dropped to his knees, mud seeping through his trousers, his world collapsing to the sight of Sophie's shallow breaths, her raincoat stained with blood and dirt. "She's my daughter!" he choked out, his voice raw, barely cutting through the wind's howl. Clara's eyes flicked to him, not with recognition of his wealth or power, but with a piercing clarity that saw only a father breaking apart. "She's in shock. Hold her hand, keep her calm," she said, her tone steady yet laced with a warmth that anchored him. James clutched Sophie's cold fingers, whispering her name, his chest tightening as her eyelids fluttered weakly. Clara moved with a quiet precision, her hands deftly tightening the tourniquet, checking Sophie's pulse, her calm a beacon against the crowd's frenzy. Paramedics barreled through, their boots pounding, and Clara's voice rose above them, clear and commanding. "Female 9, laceration on the left arm, possible fracture, signs of shock," she reported, guiding Sophie onto a stretcher with a gentleness that belied her urgency. James followed, his legs unsteady, Clara's blood-streaked hands etched into his mind like a vivid scar. In the ambulance, the siren's wail echoed his racing pulse, Sophie's face ghostly under the oxygen mask, her hand limp in his. At Seattle General Hospital, harsh fluorescent lights buzzed as Sophie was whisked to surgery, leaving James in a sterile waiting room, the linoleum reflecting his haggard face. He paced, his mind trapped in the image of Sophie's crumpled form, the terror of losing her as he'd lost Emily, his wealth powerless against this fragility. Hours stretched, each minute a heavy stone, until a doctor emerged, her scrubs crisp, her voice measured. "Sophie's stable. Fractured arm, internal bruising, but she'll pull through." James exhaled, his knees buckling, tears he'd locked away for years burning his eyes. He sank into a chair, relief slicing through the numbness he'd worn since Emily's death. Then he saw Clara near the nurse's station, her rain-soaked jacket dripping, her face etched with exhaustion, but her posture resolute. She hadn't left. "She's a fighter," Clara said, her voice soft but weighted with a knowing that hinted at her own unseen wounds. James nodded, his throat too tight to speak, gratitude mingling with a raw, unfamiliar stirring. Clara didn't know his name dominated boardrooms or headlines, didn't know he'd buried his heart with Emily, but her steady gaze saw through his armor, finding the man beneath. In that moment, a fracture formed in his grief-hardened walls, a faint hope flickering where only darkness had lingered. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, he felt a spark of connection, fragile and uncharted, pulling him towards something he couldn't yet name. In the dim glow of Seattle General Hospital's cafeteria, James Carver sat across from Clara Evans, the hum of vending machines and the clink of a janitor's mop fading into the background as they shared a quiet corner table, 2 styrofoam, cups of lukewarm coffee between them. Sophie's surgery had left her stable but confined to a recovery ward, her small body tethered to IVs and monitors, and James, still raw from the pier's chaos, felt a strange pull toward Clara, whose steady presence had anchored him through the worst night of his life. She wore a simple sweater now, her rain-soaked jacket discarded, but her hazel eyes carried the same intensity he'd seen on the pier, now softened by fatigue and something unspoken. He'd insisted on thanking her properly, expecting her to decline. But when she agreed to coffee, he felt a flicker of hope he hadn't dared entertain since Emily's death. Clara stirred her coffee absently, her fingers tracing the cup's rim, and broke the silence first, her voice low but deliberate. "Sophie reminds me of someone I lost. A cousin, Ellie, same age, same spark." She didn't elaborate, but the weight in her words hinted at a wound still tender, and James, usually guarded, found himself leaning in, wanting to know more. He spoke of Emily, how her sudden death had left him adrift, a father who'd buried his grief in work, leaving Sophie to navigate her own loss with nannies and tutors. Clara listened, her gaze never wavering, and when she spoke it was with a blunt honesty that disarmed him. "Kids feel everything, even what you don't say. Sophie's been carrying your silence." Her words stung, but they rang true, and James felt a pang of guilt for the distance he'd let grow between him and his daughter. Over the next few days, Clara became a quiet fixture in Sophie's hospital room, stopping by after her shifts to check charts or sit by Sophie's bed, her presence easing the sterile tension. Sophie's eyes lit up when Clara arrived, her small voice asking for stories about animals or silly hospital anecdotes, and Clara obliged, her laughter soft but infectious, filling the room with a warmth James hadn't known in years. One afternoon, as Sophie napped, Clara stood by the window, sunlight catching the faint freckles on her cheeks, and James found himself studying her, not as the nurse who'd saved his daughter, but as a woman who seemed to carry her own quiet strength. He asked her about Ellie, and Clara's voice grew distant, recounting a car accident when she was 12, her cousin's laughter cut short by a drunk driver, leaving Clara as the sole survivor. "I wanted to save people after that," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon, "but it never fills the hole." James nodded, understanding the ache of a loss that lingers, and for a moment their shared silence felt like a bridge, fragile but real. He offered to take her to dinner, a proper thank you, but Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "I don't do well with people like you, people the world watches," she said, her honesty cutting but not cruel. James smiled faintly, respecting her boundaries, and suggested a walk instead, to which she agreed, surprising him. They strolled through a nearby park, the air crisp with early autumn, leaves crunching underfoot, and talked about small things, old music, rainy Seattle winters, the way Sophie's smile could light up a room. Clara's guard softened, her laughter coming easier, and James felt a warmth he'd forgotten, a sense of being seen not as a mogul but as a man. When they parted, her hand brushed his briefly, an accidental touch that lingered in his chest, stirring a longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Back at the hospital, Sophie drew a picture of Clara holding her hand, the crayon lines shaky but vivid, and handed it to James with a grin. "She makes it less scary," Sophie said, and James tucked the drawing into his wallet, a talisman of something new. Clara's presence was changing him, peeling back layers of grief he'd buried, but he sensed her hesitation, a wariness that mirrored his own fear of opening his heart again. As they said goodbye that evening, Clara's eyes held his a moment, longer than necessary, and James knew this was no longer just gratitude. It was the beginning of something neither of them had planned, something that scared them both in its quiet intensity. As Sophie's recovery progressed in the quiet hum of Seattle General's pediatric wing, James Carver found himself drawn to Clara Evans in ways that both unsettled and electrified him, her presence weaving into his days like a melody he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Sophie, now propped up in bed with a cast on her arm, giggled at Clara's tales of mischievous hospital cats, her trust in the nurse blooming brighter each day, a stark contrast to the guarded distance James had, unknowingly fostered with his daughter. Clara's visits were no longer just professional. She lingered after her shifts, reading picture books in a voice that made Sophie's world feel safe, her hazel eyes softening when she caught James watching. Outside the hospital, they began meeting at a small park near Sophie's physical therapy sessions, where autumn leaves painted the ground gold and the air carried a crisp promise of change. Clara walked with her hands in her pockets, her scarf loose around her neck, and James, shedding his usual suit for a sweater, felt the weight of his corporate armor lift in her company. They talked about music, Clara's love for jazz, James's secret fondness for folk, and shared stories of childhood, hers in a noisy Portland household, his in a quiet Tacoma suburb. One evening, as they sat on a bench watching Sophie attempt her first steps with a walker, Clara admitted she'd once dreamed of being a painter. A dream buried after her cousin Ellie's death shifted her toward nursing. James, surprised by his own openness, confessed he'd stopped playing guitar after Emily's death, the instrument now gathering dust in a closet. "You should play again," Clara said, her gaze steady, and he felt a pull to unearth that part of himself, long buried under grief and ambition. Sophie's growing attachment to Clara was undeniable. She'd cling to her hand during therapy, her small face brightening at Clara's encouragement, and James saw a warmth in his daughter he'd failed to nurture alone. One afternoon, Sophie handed Clara a drawing of the three of them under a cartoon sun, her cast-covered arm making the lines wobbly but heartfelt. "You're like my best friend," Sophie said, and Clara's smile faltered, a flicker of pain crossing her face before she hugged the girl tightly. Later, over coffee, in the park's cafe, James pressed gently, asking about the shadow in her expression. Clara's fingers tightened around her mug, and she spoke of Ellie's accident, how she'd been in the car, helpless as her cousin died beside her, the guilt that drove her to save others but left her wary of love. "I'm scared of caring. Too much," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, and James, heart aching, reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers, not quite touching. He shared his own fear, how Emily's death had made him build walls, leaving Sophie to face her grief alone, a failure that haunted him. Their vulnerability hung between them, raw and unguarded, and for the first time James felt a connection, deeper than gratitude, a spark that both warmed and terrified him. Clara's wariness of his world, its wealth, its scrutiny, surfaced when a photographer snapped their picture in the park, a tabloid lens intruding on their quiet moment. She pulled back, her posture stiffening, and said, "I don't belong in your spotlight, James." He reassured her, promising privacy, but her hesitation lingered, a reminder of the chasm between their lives. Yet when Sophie begged Clara to read one more chapter at bedtime, Clara stayed, her voice steady as she narrated, and James watched, his heart swelling with something he hadn't dared name since Emily. One evening, as they walked back from therapy, Sophie asleep in her wheelchair, James invited Clara to a quiet dinner at his home, not a grand gesture, but a simple meal. She hesitated, then nodded, a small smile breaking through her guard. At his penthouse they cooked together, Clara chopping vegetables with a practiced ease, James fumbling but laughing, the kitchen filled with a warmth that felt like a new beginning. Sophie woke briefly, grinning at the sight of them, and James caught Clara's eye, a shared moment that felt like a promise, fragile but real. As Clara left that night, her scarf brushing his arm, James knew he was falling, not just for the woman who'd saved his daughter, but for the one who saw him through his scars, challenging him to be more than a widower or a CEO. James Carver's world, once a fortress of boardroom deals and calculated distance, began to unravel in the quiet moments after Sophie's bedtime stories, when the weight of Clara Evans's absence lingered like a shadow in his penthouse. A cryptic text arrived one night, its words sharp and anonymous. "Ask Clara about Portland, she's not who you think." The message landed like a stone in still water, rippling through James's fragile trust, stirring memories of Emily's, unspoken secrets that had surfaced after her death. Sophie, now home with her arm in a cast, chattered about Clara's stories, her crayon drawings piling up with images of the nurse's kind smile, but James's mind churned with doubt, the text's warning gnawing at him. He fought the urge to act. his instinct to protect Sophie clashing with the warmth Clara had brought into their lives, but the seed of suspicion took root. Against his better judgment, he called a private investigator, a discreet contact from his corporate world, and within days a slim file arrived detailing Clara's past in Portland. She'd worked at a trauma center where a patient, a firefighter named Mark, died under her care, sparking whispers of an inappropriate relationship and a lawsuit that ended in a sealed settlement. Clara had been cleared, but the scandal drove her to leave nursing temporarily, relocating to Seattle to start over. The file's cold facts clawed at James, echoing the betrayal he'd felt when Emily's hidden letters surfaced after her death, hinting at a life she'd never shared. He watched Clara during her next visit, as she helped Sophie with a puzzle, her laughter bright but her eyes guarded, and he hated himself for the questions burning in his chest. At a cafe near the hospital, where they'd taken to sharing quick lunches, James's silence grew heavy, his usual warmth replaced by a tension Clara sensed. "Something's wrong," she said, setting down her sandwich, her gaze searching his face. He hesitated, the file's weight in his briefcase like a loaded gun, but couldn't bring himself to confront her, not yet. Instead, he changed the subject, asking about her day, but Clara's smile faded, her intuition catching his distance. That night, alone in his study, James reread the file, the words blurring as he grappled with his fear of being fooled again, of letting someone close, only to lose them to secrets. The next day, Clara didn't come to the house. Her absence a void Sophie noticed immediately, her small voice asking, "Where's Clara?" James mumbled about a busy shift, but his heart sank, knowing she'd pulled back, sensing his doubt. He found a note slipped under his door, Clara's handwriting neat but hurried. "I need a few days, I'm not running, but I can't stay if you're pulling away." The words stung, her honesty a mirror to his cowardice, and James felt the ache of her absence like a bruise. He tried to focus on Sophie, helping her with homework, but her drawings of Clara mocked him, each one a reminder of the trust he was risking. At a therapy session, Sophie's therapist mentioned how Clara's presence had steadied her, and James's guilt deepened, his investigator's report feeling like a betrayal of the woman who'd brought light back to his daughter's eyes. He drove to Clara's apartment in Capitol Hill, a modest walk-up with Ivy climbing the brick. But she wasn't there, and a neighbor said she'd been working double shifts. Desperate, James left a voicemail, his voice tight. "Clara, I need to talk, please." She didn't call back, and the silence stretched each day without her sharpening his regret. One evening, as Sophie slept, James sat on his balcony, the city's lights blurring below, and admitted to himself he was scared, not just of Clara's past, but of how much he needed her, how her presence had begun to heal the parts of him broken since Emily. The anonymous text haunted him, its sender a ghost he couldn't name, but he knew he couldn't let fear dictate his choices again. He resolved to find Clara, to ask for the truth, even if it shattered the fragile hope they'd built. As he stared at Sophie's latest drawing, a shaky sketch of Clara pushing her wheelchair, James felt a surge of determination, a need to fight for the woman who'd seen him not as a mogul, but as a man still learning to love through his scars. The rain-soaked streets of Capitol Hill gleamed under streetlights as James Carver stood outside Clara Evans's apartment, his breath fogging in the chilly night air, the weight of his doubt pressing heavier than the investigator's file tucked under his arm. Clara's note, her plea for space after sensing his withdrawal, had left a hollow ache in his chest, and Sophie's quiet questions about her absence only deepened his regret for letting fear cloud his trust. He knocked, the sound sharp against the quiet, but the door remained shut, the windows dark. A neighbor, an older woman with a watering can, mentioned Clara had been pulling long shifts at the hospital, and James's heart sank, knowing he'd driven her away with his silence. Determined to face the truth, he drove to her building again. The next evening, the city's hum muted by his resolve. This time Clara opened the door, her face pale, her sweater loose over jeans, her hazel eyes sharp with a mix of hurt and defiance. "You found me," she said, her voice low, stepping aside to let him in. The apartment was small, cluttered with medical journals and a single photo of her cousin Ellie on the mantel, her smile hauntingly like Sophie's. James set the file. On her coffee table, its presence a silent accusation, and said, "I got a text about Portland. I looked into it." Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch, sitting across from him, her posture rigid. "You didn't ask me. You went behind my back." Her words cut, and James, his throat tight, admitted, "I was scared you were hiding something like Emily did." Clara exhaled, her gaze steady but pained, and began to speak, her voice raw with a truth she'd carried alone. In Portland, she'd known Mark, a firefighter, before he was injured in a blaze and landed in her trauma unit. They'd dated briefly, but when he became her patient, she tried to recuse herself, only for the hospital to deny her request. "I cared too much," she said, her fingers tracing the edge of a book. "I sat with him when his family couldn't, held his hand when he was scared. He went septic, and I missed it, not as his nurse, but as someone who loved him. The hospital blamed me to avoid a bigger lawsuit. The settlement had cleared her, but the scandal cost her reputation, forcing her to leave." James listened, his chest tightening at her vulnerability, the way she owned her mistakes without apology. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice softer now. Clara's eyes met his, unflinching. "Because I wanted something clean with you, something not stained by that pain." The air between them crackled with honesty, and James felt the weight of his own betrayal, his lack of trust, his quickness to judge. He leaned forward, his hands clasped, and said, "I should have asked you first. I let fear win." Clara nodded, her expression softening, but she stood, crossing her arms. "I can't be with someone who needs proof to believe me. I've been through that, and it broke me." Her words landed like a blow, and James stood, stepping closer, his voice low but urgent. "I don't want proof. I want you." Clara's eyes shimmered, but she shook her head, stepping back. "You don't trust me, James, and I can't keep proving I'm not a ghost from your past." He wanted to argue, to pull her close, but her resolve stopped him. She opened the door, the rain's soft patter filling the silence, and said, "I need time, not because I don't care, but because I do." James left, the file untouched on her table, his heart heavy with the realization he'd pushed away the one person who'd seen him beyond his grief. Driving home, the city's lights blurred through his windshield, and Sophie's latest drawing, Clara's face sketched with care, sat on the passenger seat, a quiet rebuke. He spent the night on his balcony, the investigator's report burning. In his mind, not for its facts, but for what it had cost him. Clara's absence was a void, her laughter missing from Sophie's bedtime routine, her steady presence gone from their fragile new normal. He replayed her words, her pain, and saw his own fear reflected, fear of loss, of betrayal, of loving again. By morning he knew he couldn't let her go without a fight, but the path forward felt uncertain, her trust bruised by his doubt. As Sophie asked again, "When's Clara coming back?" James's resolve hardened, a quiet vow to face his fears and seek the truth not from files, but from the woman who'd awakened his heart. James Carver sat in his sleek office overlooking Seattle's skyline, the city's lights a cold contrast to the turmoil churning within him, as a second anonymous text landed on his phone, its words slicing through the fragile hope he'd clung to since Clara's departure. "Clara's not done hiding. Check her with Nathan Reed." The name Nathan, his longtime friend and COO, hit like a betrayal, stirring a fresh wave of doubt that threatened to drown the memory of Clara's honest eyes in her Capitol Hill apartment. Sophie's laughter, once brightened by Clara's stories, had dimmed, her questions about the nurse's absence growing quieter, and James felt the sting of his failure to protect her heart and his own from this new uncertainty. Nathan, with his easy charm and shared history of late-night strategy sessions, had been a brother in all but blood, yet the text's implication gnawed at him. He resisted the urge to dig again, the investigator's file still a bitter lesson. But the seed of suspicion took root, fueled by the lingering pain of Emily's hidden truths. At a board meeting, Nathan's casual banter felt off, his smile too polished, and James's gut twisted, wondering what else he'd missed in his inner circle. That evening, another message arrived, a grainy photo of Clara and Nathan at a hospital gala, his hand on her arm, her smile tight but present, dated months before she'd met James. The image burned, its intimacy a silent accusation, and James's resolve cracked. He called Nathan to his office the next morning, the glass walls closing in as he laid the photo on the desk, his voice low but sharp. "What was this, Nathan?" Nathan's face paled, his usual confidence faltering, and he admitted to a brief romance with Clara, met at the gala when she was new to Seattle before she knew his connection to James. "It was nothing serious," Nathan said, his hands raised. "She ended it, said she wasn't ready for my world, your world. I didn't know she'd meet you." James's jaw tightened, the photo's date clashing with Clara's claim of wanting something clean with him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he pressed, and Nathan's eyes dropped, a flicker of guilt betraying his calm. "Because it didn't matter. She didn't want me, James. She looked at you differently." The words should have soothed, but they didn't, the anonymous sender's shadow looming larger. James dug deeper, pulling phone records and gala guest lists, and found a pattern, discrete payments from Nathan's personal account to an unknown contact, timed with the texts. The realization hit hard. Nathan had orchestrated the messages, feeding James just enough to fracture his trust in Clara, a calculated move born of envy or spite. Furious, James confronted Nathan again, this time in a quiet cafe, away from corporate. "Eyes. You sent the texts," he said, his voice cold, the photo trembling in his hand. Nathan didn't deny it, his shoulders slumping. "I saw how she looked at you, how you changed with her. I've been in your shadow forever, James. I wanted something to hurt like I did." The admission was a gut punch, Nathan's jealousy, a mirror to James's own fears of losing what mattered. He fired Nathan on the spot, cutting ties with a friend who'd become a stranger, but the victory felt hollow. Clara's absence a heavier loss. Back home, Sophie's latest drawing, a sketch of Clara reading to her, lay on the kitchen counter, and James's heart ached, knowing he'd let fear and manipulation drive a wedge between them. He drove to Clara's apartment, but the lights were off, the neighbor saying she'd left for Portland, a trip to clear her head. James sat in his car, the photo of Clara and Nathan beside Sophie's drawing, and saw the truth he'd been too scared to face. Clara's love was real, her past. No different from his own flawed history. He booked a flight to Portland that night, the plane's hum a backdrop to his resolve to find her, not to accuse but to listen, to rebuild what he'd broken. As the city lights faded below, he clutched Sophie's drawing, its crayon lines, a reminder of the family he wanted, not just for his daughter but for himself, with Clara at its heart. Portland's grey skies loomed over the narrow, weathered house in a quiet Lincoln Park neighborhood. Its peeling green paint and sagging porch, a stark contrast to the sleek Seattle world James Carver had left behind, his heart pounding with a mix of resolve and fear as he stood at Clara Evans's childhood home. The flight had been a blur. Sophie's crayon drawing of Clara tucked in his coat pocket, a fragile reminder of what he stood to lose if he couldn't repair the trust he'd broken. Clara's absence had left a void in his penthouse. Sophie's bedtime stories now quiet, her small voice asking why Clara hadn't called, and James knew he'd let Nathan's betrayal and his own doubts push away the woman who'd awakened his heart. He knocked, the sound swallowed by the drizzle, and when Clara opened the door, her face was a map of exhaustion and resolve, her oversized sweater swallowing her frame, her hazel eyes wary but not cold. "James," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and resignation, stepping aside to let him in. The house smelled of old wood and coffee, a suitcase by the stairs, an open photo album on the coffee table showing Clara and Ellie, their smiles identical, frozen in a time before loss. He didn't sit, his words spilling out raw and unpolished. "I was wrong, Clara, about Portland, about Nathan, about everything. I let fear make me doubt you." She crossed her arms, her gaze steady but guarded, and he pressed on, recounting. Nathan's confession, how his jealousy had fueled the anonymous texts, the photo, the lies meant to tear them apart. Clara's eyes widened, a flicker of anger crossing her face, but she stayed silent, letting him speak. He pulled out Sophie's drawing, its wobbly lines a testament to his daughter's love, and his voice broke. "I should have trusted you. Not a file, not a stranger's words. I'm scared of losing you, of loving again, but I'm more scared of living without you." Clara's expression softened, her fingers brushing the photo album, and she spoke, her voice low but steady, revealing why she'd come to Portland, to donate Ellie's belongings, to close a chapter she'd avoided for years. "I thought I could move forward with you, but when you doubted me, it felt like losing her all over again," she said, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. James stepped closer, his heart aching at her pain, and admitted his own scars. How Emily's hidden letters had left him terrified of being blindsided, how he'd judged Clara through that lens. "I don't want perfect," he said, his voice raw. "I want real, and you're the realest thing I've ever known." Clara's breath hitched, and she turned to the album, pointing to a photo of Ellie laughing in a park, her voice trembling as she spoke of the guilt she carried, surviving when her cousin didn't, choosing nursing to atone but never feeling. Enough. James reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away, her fingers warm against his. "You're enough," he whispered, and the words hung between them, a fragile bridge over their shared wounds. Clara nodded, her eyes searching his, and said, "I'm scared too, James, of caring, of losing again, but I want to try." They sat on the worn couch, the rain a soft rhythm outside, and talked, not of Nathan or Portland, but of small hopes, teaching Sophie to bake, painting Clara's old canvases together, building something new. The distance between them shrank, not with grand gestures but with quiet truths, their hands still clasped. As night fell, Clara showed him Ellie's room, filled with childhood trinkets, a stuffed bear, a sketchbook, and James saw the weight she'd carried, the life she was letting go to move forward. He shared a memory of Emily's laugh, how it echoed in Sophie's, and Clara listened, her presence a balm to his lingering grief. They didn't kiss, didn't rush, but the air between them felt alive, charged with possibility. By morning, Clara agreed to return to Seattle, not as a promise of forever, but as a step towards something real. James drove her to the airport, Sophie's drawing between them, and as the plane lifted off, he felt a quiet certainty. He wasn't just chasing Clara, but choosing a life where love could grow through scars, where trust could be rebuilt. One honest moment at a time. A year later, under the golden haze of a Seattle sunset, James Carver stood on the porch of a lakeside cabin, the gentle lapping of water against the dock mingling with Sophie's laughter as she chased fireflies with Clara Evans, their silhouettes framed against the fading light. Clara had moved into James's life, not just his penthouse but his heart, her presence a steady anchor that transformed their fractured world into something whole. Sophie, her arm healed and her spirit brighter, had begged Clara to stay forever. One night, her small arms wrapped around her in a hospital room, and Clara's quiet promise, "I'm not going anywhere," had become a vow they all held close. The cabin, nestled in the Cascades, was their escape, a place where city noise and past betrayals felt distant. Clara's toothbrush sat next to James's in the bathroom, her old sketchbook now filled with new drawings, some of Sophie's, some of her own, a quiet reclaiming of the artist she'd buried. One morning, as they ate pancakes at the cabin's worn table, Sophie spotted a glint on Clara's finger, a simple silver ring engraved with "We Stayed," a gift from James that marked their choice to build through pain. "Is that a real diamond?" Sophie asked, eyes wide, and Clara laughed, her cheeks flushing. "Just a small one, I didn't want a rock." James, pouring juice, smirked. "She picked the smallest one in the store, said anything bigger would feel like a spotlight." Sophie grinned, declaring it perfect, and James felt a warmth that had once seemed impossible, a family stitched together not by perfection, but by choice. A letter arrived that week, postmarked from a rehab center in Oregon, Nathan's, handwriting jagged but clear. "I was wrong, Clara. I hurt you because I couldn't face my own failures. I'm trying to be better. Thank you for being more than I deserved." Clara read it silently, then passed it to James, her expression calm but resolute. "He doesn't define us," she said, and James nodded, squeezing her hand, the weight of Nathan's betrayal now a faint scar rather than a wound. They planned a wedding, small and private, in the cabin's backyard, with only 10 guests. Sophie, her therapist, a few close friends, and Clara's mother, who cried quietly through the vows. Clara wore a soft ivory dress, its hem brushing the grass, and James wore a linen suit, his father's old watch on his wrist. The judge, a friend of Clara's from nursing school, stumbled over her words, moved by their honesty. Clara spoke, first her voice steady, eyes locked on James. "I thought love was for other people, the ones who didn't carry ghosts. But you saw mine and stayed, and you gave me a home I didn't know I could have." James, his throat tight, replied, "You showed me I could live again, not just survive." They kissed, the lake reflecting their silhouettes, and Sophie cheered, tossing wildflowers that caught in Clara's hair. The media tried to spin it, tech mogul's quiet wedding, but Clara and James ignored the headlines, their life no longer a story for others to tell. Back in Seattle, Clara started painting again, her canvases filling their home with color, while James picked up his guitar, playing soft chords for Sophie at night. One evening, Sophie asked Clara, "Are you my mum now?" And Clara paused, her eyes soft. "I'm your Clara, and I love you like you're mine." James, watching from the doorway, felt his heart swell. The grief for Emily still there, but no longer a barrier. They bought the cabin permanently, a place for summers and healing, where Sophie learned to fish, her giggles echoing over the water. Clara wrote a memoir after the storm, starting with the night on the pier, its pages raw with her journey from guilt to grace. James read it in one sitting, tears falling at her courage, and left a note inside the cover. "You're my home." On their first anniversary, James surprised Clara with a new ring, the original recast with a tiny engraving. "We grew." She laughed through tears, pulling him close, and they danced in the cabin's kitchen, Sophie spinning around them, a family built not on fairy tales, but on truths hard-won. Their love wasn't flawless. It held arguments, late-night talks, about fears, moments of doubt, but it was real, rooted in the choice to stay, to build, to love through the mess of their pasts. As the sun dipped below the lake, Clara whispered, "We're enough." And James knew, in every fiber of his being, that they were.